Okay. Moby-Dick, Lecture 5, Landlessness, or The Fear of the Whale is the Beginning of Wisdom. We ended last time with the idea that we are all shipmates in this world. We are all bedfellows lodging together in this strange spouter inn where we don't always have a choice about who we're sharing a bunk with. Our family, our neighbors, whether they're Christians or cannibals. I'm speaking figuratively here, of course. If your neighbors are actual cannibals, you should move. And from this state of affairs that Melville has been describing of like being stuck together, so let's make the best of it, Ishmael has derived an ethic of humility in regard to other people and their belief systems. So about Queequeg and his strange Ramadan, he says, quote, "Let him be. And heaven have mercy on all of us, Presbyterians and pagans alike, for we are all somehow dreadfully cracked about the head and sadly need mending." However, as we've seen Melville do before, he will also poke fun at this statement of Ishmael's, at that part of himself that wants to sort of embrace everything with open arms. And Melville's going to do it through a kind of reductio ad absurdum rhetorical technique. You guys probably know that phrase already from Latin, reductio ad absurdum. And it's like where you keep going with a sensible idea until at some point it becomes absurd. And it's funny because you've taken it too far. And Melville loves doing this. And Ishmael's humility very easily slips into like a parody of humility as a kind of like Enlightenment religious agnosticism, where he's, you know, just telling himself and Queequeg that quote, "Hell is an idea firstborn of an undigested apple dumpling." It kind of sounds like Scrooge from A Christmas Carol, where he says like, "The ghost, you're just, you know, a piece of undigested beef." And, you know, Queequeg is like, "Well, yeah, I know what you mean about indigestion. I had this feast one time on my island where we all ate like 50 guys once after a battle. We ate our enemies and they gave me such a bad stomach ache." And Ishmael's like, "Okay, that will do. That's enough of religious tolerance for me." And, you know, maybe this liberal idea of to each his own is not fully adequate to get to the truth of what's going on here either. Even though that may be a helpful idea to an extent to keep us humble and to keep us open. You know, nevertheless, Ishmael and Queequeg still do manage a kind of friendship and bond of affection, and maybe something a little more some scholars have suggested. Nevertheless, okay, what happens next is that Peleg and Bildad, the retired captains, remember, who are part owners of the Pequod, the ship that Ishmael and Queequeg are set to sail in, these guys prefer to have pagan cannibals as their harpooneers because, quote, "No harpooneer is worth a straw who ain't pretty sharkish." That's a good adjective, sharkish. I'm going to start to use that. We should mention, of course, that the Pequod, right? This is the ship, is named after the Native American tribe, the Pequots, right? Who were massacred first by smallpox and then by New England settlers, like young Goodman Brown's fictional grandfather in the Hawthorne story. And there is even like a giant wigwam on the deck of the ship while she's in harbor, just to remind the reader of these like quasi-genocidal events that stand behind that name. And the ship, you know, is also you know, tricked out with whale bones, with like sperm whale teeth for whalings and like a whale's jaw for a tiller. And it's basically like just this floating factory of death, designed for one purpose: to hunt down these gentle ocean giants and melt their bodies into oil for American industry. I think I mentioned before that while there are no overt like save the whales messages in Moby-Dick, Melville repeatedly ascribes human qualities to the whales, as we'll see in a few chapters, and bestial qualities to the hunters. The ship is just marked with death from the outset, from its name. And so, to Melville's reader, sailing aboard a ship named the Pequod is not a good omen. And speaking of ill omens, right, they're trying to get aboard the ship and they meet on the dock this guy, Elijah. And we talked a lot about that name last time, where it comes from in the Old Testament. And Elijah, Melville's Elijah, says, have ye shipped already with that ship? Did you sign on the dotted line? Did the contract say anything about, oh, I don't know, your souls? And it's like this pretty comical, like cheesy horror movie dialogue. And Elijah, there's this back and forth a couple times. Elijah is always saying, have ye heard the prophecy concerning Ahab? And Ishmael and Queequeg are like, what prophecy? And Elijah says, well, good morning to ye. I must be moving along now. Did you happen to notice anyone else sneaking on board late last night that maybe shouldn't be on this ship at all? And Ishmael's like, no, like, what are you talking about? And Elijah says, well, morning to ye. See you later. Have a nice trip. And this exchange kind of goes on for a while with the foreshadowing, and the chapter ends with Ishmael pronouncing Elijah a humbug in his heart. Also kind of like Scrooge, actually. I wonder if Dickens read Melville. Moby-Dick did come out in England first before America, and it's well before A Christmas Carol. I should look into that, write a paper on it or something. Okay, anyway, there's an old saying, many of you have probably heard this, that a prophet is without honor in his hometown. A prophet is without honor in his hometown, right? Prophets are considered troublemakers in their hometowns, in their own times, even if they go down in history as heroes and truth tellers. A troubler of Israel is what Elijah is called in the Old Testament. Just like, maybe Martin Luther King Jr. was widely seen by far too many people as just like a pot stirrer in his lifetime. At least people saw him that way, in the South or like in Chicago, where he was working as a community organizer on some fair housing practices in the inner city. And even these like Northerners who live in Illinois, right? This is the land of Lincoln. These guys are like, nope, not in my backyard. Go trouble somebody else's town. And of course, hindsight is 2020, and now we honor prophets like Dr. King rightly with a national holiday. But again, the prophets are not the ones who are predicting the future necessarily. In that case, they'd be harmless. Rather, they're the ones who are pointing out the injustices of the present and calling us out on our complicity with them. And so, even though the rest of us might consider them humbugs or like Debbie Downers for doing so, that's really a judgment on us, not on them. That's a judgment on our complacency and moral slumber. If we're the people who are saying, why do you always have to focus on the bad? The prophets are going to reply, well, because somebody's got to. Nobody else will. So, up front, there's got to be a man in black till things are brighter. I'm the man in black, to quote Johnny Cash. Okay, but you guys get this. That's Elijah. Ishmael is no prophet, right? We can't conflate Ishmael with Melville, no matter how much Melville is using that genre of the American Jeremiad form. On page 101, Ishmael lays bare in this brilliant passage what psychologists today would call our cognitive biases, right? We tend to ignore information that challenges what we want to believe about the world, and we tend to pay attention to information that confirms what we already think. so that we don't have to change what we think, because change is hard. And Ishmael, remember, like, what does he want? He really wants to go to sea and see the world. Remember on page 1, he says that going to sea is going to be his substitute for pistol and ball, right? In other words, he was melancholy and considering suicide. And so, like, he's got a lot of motivation to get to sea. And so he ignores basically all these warning signs about Ahab. He's got these rationalizations. Ahab didn't name himself. Maybe he's named Ahab, but that doesn't mean anything. Surely his name is not his destiny. And it's like, well, Ishmael, in retrospect, it's weird that you signed up for this voyage without bothering to meet the captain first, the man who would be absolute dictator of it. That's Melville's phrase from page 101, this phrase, absolute dictator, which is important to many 20th century critics who saw Moby-Dick as kind of like this deep dive into collectivist thinking, the kind of thinking that gave rise eventually in the 30s and 40s to dictators like Hitler and Stalin and these other totalitarians. So this passage on page 101, American critics in the 20th century just loved this passage. You can see why. But here's the cognitive biases passage. Ishmael says, when a man suspects any wrong, it sometimes happens that if he be already involved in the matter, he insensibly strives to cover up his suspicions even from himself. And much this way it was with me. I said nothing and tried to think nothing. Right? Because he doesn't want to go, he doesn't want Elijah to be right. He wants to go to sea. And so he ignores all these warning signs, like the Pequod being, a floating, ossuary with bones and all the coffins and stuff that he runs into. In a similar way, right? It's not that everybody in a totalitarian society chooses to go along with every single move the dictator makes as he moves the country toward the creation of like death camps and gulags. It's just that we don't want to believe bad things about this person who is telling us what we want to hear. And it's very convenient because they're favoring us and not these other people. And so we'll just ignore the evidence of their injustice and evil, and we prefer to think nothing and say nothing, as Ishmael describes his state of mind as he's shipping out on the Pequod, despite the fact that it didn't take a very subtle literary critic to see all the warning signs. It's just that we as people, for us, it's easier to choose silence over prophetic truth-telling, over listening to the prophets. There's this great essay on Emerson, one of Melville's sort of great inspirations. Emerson. It's by this essay on Emerson is by one of my old Cal Poly professors, this guy Inchausti, Robert Inchausti. And Inchausti describes Emerson's enemy not so much as like a particular like philosophical or political system, so much as he uses this phrase. I love this phrase. He calls it the non-thought of received ideas. The non-thought of received ideas. I've never forgotten that. That's what Emerson's enemy is, right? Non-thought it's the opposite of thought, right? It's what the prophets and the poets of the American Renaissance are trying to shatter with their message of like self-reliance and think for yourself and trust yourself. That message that Emersonian message of self-reliance is set against the non-thought of received ideas, ideas which do your thinking for you. And this is why writers like Emerson and Melville and Whitman are key. They were seen as like key to the survival of democracy by these 20th century American critics who are sort of setting American literature over and against the literature of fascism and totalitarianism in this age of mass movements, which are always threatening to come back because it's so much easier to just go along with the non-thought of received ideas. And that's why we need Melville and Whitman and the Prophets. We never want to divorce our study of literature from the study of history here at SLOCA, right? We're seeking wisdom, not just to ace the test. So we want to sort of see these, how different critics have read these books throughout the years and found wisdom in them for their own time. All right, so eventually Ishmael and Queequeg get aboard and they set sail on Christmas, and it's snowy and there's still no sign of Ahab, really, since the captain isn't exactly necessary for getting the ship out of the harbor. The pilot can do that. But Peleg and Bildad are there to see them off on the voyage. And Bildad says, hey, guys, don't whale it too much on the Lord's Day, on Sunday. But also, don't miss a fair chance either, right? This is just like typical Bildad. He wants to worship God on Sunday, but also wants to make some money. He wants God and mammon both ways, both at once. And this is what I had called earlier the wisdom of the land, sort of the worldly wise, like, try to do the right thing, but if an opportunity comes along, that sort of thing, where success is to just like make a ton of money, even if it means grinding the faces of the poor or like harming like the beautiful creatures of the earth or the sea. And then once you've done that, then you go to church on Sunday and you say a prayer. And this is like what the prophets are really keen to call out as like a false way of living. And this is what Kierkegaard laughs at. He says, I saw that this was adult life and I laughed. And that's Bildad. You see this though, here's the pivot point. Here's where, that kind of gets us caught up more or less from the last reading. And now we get to this like incredible, weird, short chapter 23 called The Lee Shore. It's just one of my favorite chapters in the whole book, where Ishmael begins to leave behind all of this like compromise, this Bildadian compromise that passes for worldly wisdom back there on the land. Some quick vocab, right? The chapter is called The Lee Shore. Well, lee means shelter. So in the Lee Shore chapter, Melville is warning us to avoid the leeward land, right? Which is the port, the shelter, because when you're in the storm, the sheltering lee shore is actually quite dangerous, right? You can run aground and crash there close to the shore. It's actually better to get your boat out of the harbor and ride out the gale in the open sea, where you're more flexible and you can be tossed about without worrying about running aground, and your boat won't slam into anything. So this is page 110. I'll read you part of the passage. I'll read it to you in two sections. I think this is page 110, chapter 23, The Lee Shore. And he says, the port would fain give succor. The port is pitiful. In the port is safety, comfort, hearthstone, supper, warm blankets, friends, and all that's kind to our mortalities. But in that gale, the port, the land, is that ship's direst jeopardy. She must fly all hospitality. One touch of land, though it but graze the keel, would make her shudder through and through, her only friend, her bitterest foe. So Melville is saying, right, that what is safe in one context, the land, the port, the shore, the lee shore, is dangerous in another, in the storm. So don't go out there chasing safety. There is no such thing as absolute safety. Seek instead of comfort and safety, seek the truth, and you'll be all right, even if you're not, even if you're battered by the storm. Things get like a little tricky here because remember how Ishmael says earlier that nothing is what it is in itself, only by contrast? Well, that applies to the lee shore too. In nautical terms, the lee shore is defined as the opposite of what's called the windward shore. And so this is a really key point, right? These terms, lee shore, windward shore, they actually change based on your reference point, based on where you're standing. The direction of the lee shore, the direction of the truth, the direction of safety changes. The lee shore's location depends on whether your ship is heading into the harbor or away from it. And Melville says that the truth is kind of like that. So, for example, if you and I are hanging out up in Atascadero at Back Porch Bakery, and I tell you that to get to SLO, you got to drive south. I've told you the truth. But say you're down next week in Pismo and you just repeat slavishly without thinking, yeah, to get to SLO, drive south. Those directions are useless to you unless you know where you are and what direction you're pointed in. There's more to wisdom than just regurgitating something that someone else has told you. You got to know the truth. You got to know yourself. You got to know where you are in relation to everything else. And, many of us in our, religious upbringings and in our sloka education have received some pretty reliable sets of directions to find these safe harbors of truth where we're able to shelter a while in safety. And yet, part of your education, as teachers, we want to also give you not just a harbor that's temporary, but also a compass, right, and a star chart, so that you'll be able to leave these safe harbors, which eventually will not be safe, and you'll still be able to navigate and to think for yourself, because a gale does pick up from time to time, right? You will have storms in your life that shake everything up. I promise you. Some of you've had more than your fair share already. And the truth requires us to leave the shelter of the harbor under those conditions in order to stay safe. And so he says, this is the second part of the quote. This is the top of page 111. He says, all deep, earnest thinking is but the intrepid effort of the soul to keep the open independence of her sea, where the wildest winds of heaven and earth conspire to cast her on the treacherous, slavish shore. But as in landlessness alone resides the highest truth, shoreless, indefinite as God, so better is it to perish in that howling infinite than to be ingloriously dashed upon the lee, even if that were safety. It's a heck of a passage. Memorize it. I used to have it memorized. I should memorize it again. Look, some of you may have heard this saying. It's like an inspiring saying that, quote, a ship in harbor is safe, but that's not what ships are built for. I think that might even be like a sloka thing that we repeat sometimes. And it's true, right? A ship in harbor is safe, but that's not what ships are built for. You could also maybe picture this like plastered on a poster, an inspirational poster, like in an office cubicle somewhere with like a picture of a ship setting forth and the sun rising behind it. But Melville is actually going like well beyond this, isn't he? He's not saying like, go explore your dreams. That's what you were made for. He's saying actually like the harbor is more treacherous to us sometimes because it gives you the illusion that you are exploring your dreams when actually you're just like going back and forth across Morro Bay and not ever like really getting out to sea where the real stuff is happening. The truth is infinite, like the ocean, and the infinite is dangerous because you can lose yourself in it. But it would also be treacherous for us to just stay in the bay. That would be a slavish use of your education, not to take to sea and see for yourself what's really out there. So we want you to have both the shelter of the harbor and the tools to take to sea and see, experience the howling infinite, whatever that might mean. One other key point in this passage, note Melville's diction, note his word choice, which takes the form here largely of negation, right? He talks about, uses the phrase shoreless, and so shoreless, indefinite, ingloriously, right? And then, of course, landless. These are all negative prefixes and suffixes. Melville isn't trying to say something like positive and inspiring, like take to sea. He's saying something else. He's saying like, avoid the land, be land, lake to sea. He's saying something else. He's saying like, avoid the land, be landless. Okay, well, what's the difference? You got to imagine that Melville chooses this word landlessness for a reason. Landless is a negation. It's a negation that contains the thing that it negates within it, right? It uses the word land only to negate it. These negations are sayings that are also unsayings. And Melville thinks that this is all deep, earnest thinking is like, what all of our search for truth is like, that it's a saying that is also an unsaying at the same time. Because if you say that's the lee shore, you might be right now, but at another point you might be wrong. And so it has to be a saying that is also an unsaying in the same breath. That's what thinking is. That's what the truth is about. It's not about the dogmatism of a positive statement, like San Luis Obispo is south, right? That would be dogmatic. It's going to be true sometimes and not other times. We don't want to retreat into the shore, the land of our own like tiny little truths. Nor do we want to fall prey to the infinite skepticism of like, there is no land, there is no truth. No, the land is there in that word landless. It's there, even if only negatively, contained within the word landlessness. Right? So Melville is saying that thinking holds an allegiance to the truth that is neither dogmatic nor skeptical. It doesn't stay in the harbor and doesn't sink to the bottom. This is a conception of truth that will float, that will get you somewhere, that is buoyant. This is a truth that travels, that allows you to navigate by the stars. This is as good a description of thinking as I've encountered, right? Thinking as landlessness. It's not land and it's not land. And maybe that's what he's up to here. Maybe not. I think it's a cool word. I think it's a cool way of expressing this. And I have to believe that Melville is using it intentionally for some purpose. But you guys figure it out from there. I could be totally wrong. The cool thing here, I think, is that all this lee shore business is sort of cast as like a brief goodbye to this character, Bulkington. It's a weird goodbye, right? We barely even said hello to Bulkington. Melville introduces him briefly at the Spouter Inn, like 18 chapters back or something, and then he brings Bulkington back only to bury him here with this 6-inch chapter that is the stoneless grave of Bulkington, right? Note there's another negation there, stoneless. Always look for negations in Melville. Ishmael basically reveals to us that Bulkington will not survive this voyage. And so he's like, I'm not going to say anything more about him, except that in his death, he is finally in possession of the truth that he sought in life. And so he says, this is great. He says, know ye now, Bulkington, now that you're dead, glimpses do ye seem to see of that mortally intolerable truth. Right? That's the truth that we mortals can't possess until we die. It's mortally intolerable. And he ends the chapter with this just amazing, flight of verbal, I don't even know what to call it. He says, up from the stray of thy ocean perishing, straight up leaps thy apotheosis. So like Bulkington, like when you die and you go down with the ship and then your soul rises straight up, leaps the apotheosis, then you'll have the truth that you sought in this life in landlessness. Bulkington is sort of this figure who the land is scorching to his feet. So he's always like seeking the truth, but of course never totally finding it in Melville's world. So there goes Bulkington, right? He's now sort of gone. Melville has written him in only to write him out. And this is like one of the, yet another archaeological layer of Moby-Dick that is now buried as the novel really starts to find its new purpose beyond just being a sea story where Bulkington and Ishmael go on this adventure. He's like, enough of that. Goodbye, Bulkington. Time to get a little bit weird. And it really, the Lee Shore chapter is a fantastic and weird and intense little chapter, isn't it? Straight up leaps thy apotheosis. And then just immediately he pivots again and he backs off. Ishmael backs off and goes on this like really silly rant in the chapter called The Advocate, where he is in this like imaginary dialogue with somebody who keeps like questioning whether whaling is really all that honorable and glorious. And Ishmael's like, I'm going to give you all the reasons why whaling is awesome. You know, whales are considered royal fish by English common law. And look, the writer of Job was into whales, and King Alfred the Great and Ben Franklin. These were all whalemen, or like descendants of whalemen. And, you know, a whale ship, it was my Yale College and my Harvard, and you can learn just as much at sea as you can sitting at a desk. And, you know, we use whale oil, of course, to anoint kings and queens, to coronate them. So, of course, whaling is glorious and honorable and regal. And, you know, like the tone change between this chapter and The Advocate and the Lee Shore chapter just gives you like whiplash. This is one of the things that early critics hated about Moby-Dick, but we just kind of can't help but love it, you know, in our sort of like more postmodern era. Moby-Dick just can't decide what kind of book it wants to be, chapter by chapter. And Melville is just kind of like following the muse wherever inspiration leads. And it's almost like his only criterion for whether something gets into the novel or not is whether it's not like whether it fits perfectly with everything else, like a well-oiled machine, but it's like, is this prose here alive? Does this idea burn with the fire of consciousness? And if so, like, let it get in there. And we'll just keep piling these chapters up. And that's what gives the book the same energy of life and makes it like more than just like a bloodless academic exercise, like they would do at, you know, students would do if they're stuck in their desks at Yale or at Harvard. I have my Yale hat here. I should switch headgear in honor of Yale College. If you guys ever visit New Haven, Connecticut, the Yale hockey rink is actually shaped like a giant whale. It's really cool. There's like big ribs and the huge like tail out front, and everybody on campus calls it the whale. And I have no idea if the architect had Moby-Dick in mind or not. It could just be like a fancy architect showing off, but it is a really awesome building. And anyway, the whale and Yale, and it even looks like a tail. And so I have to wear it for the rest of this video. Okay, the Knights and Squires chapter. On to Knights and Squires. Remember, he's really interested in like elevating whaling, so he doesn't call them just, you know, harpooneers. And he's saying this is like Knights and Squires, like chivalry and sort of high culture is involved in this, you know, occupation of whaling. So he's going to introduce the mates of the ship, of the Pequod. All right, first, you got Starbuck. Starbuck is the first mate, and he comes in on page 116. Starbuck is brave. He is no nonsense. He is straightforward. He's a family man. He's rugged. He's hardworking, conscientious. He's pious. He's sober. He's calm, serious, grounded. He's basically like everything that Ishmael is not, right? Ishmael's kind of he's a bit of a clown. He's a bit of a ham. Starbuck has none of this in him. Starbuck he's described as, quote, no crusader after perils. In other words, he is not interested in risking his life for no reason, just for money. And he is described because he's practical, right? Starbuck is he's fearless and cautious for a whaleman. Yeah, there's always that qualification. Starbuck is described as lean, and they talk about his flesh being hard as a twice-baked biscuit. And they say, you know, the summers have dried up all his physical superfluousness until there's nothing left but a kind of like essential hardiness and practicality. And basically, Starbuck gets rid of like all of the frivolous stuff of life until he represents just like the ordinary virtues, right? This is like the good stuff that's left over when you get rid of all the like, you know, joking around that Ishmael's doing. So Starbuck has temperance, he has wisdom, he has self-control, and in like another maybe less visionary book, Starbuck might be the hero, where his virtues triumph over Ahab's vices after like great struggle. But you know, you guys, Moby-Dick is not some simple morality play where good triumphs over evil, because life is not some simple morality play where good always wins. So look, you guys, this is just like true about the world, I promise you. The virtues, right? The Sloka character traits, all the stuff that Starbuck embodies, these things are real. They are realer than just about anything else in the world that you could pursue, and they are worth your time and your effort and your life, and they will get you far, these virtues, these character traits, in terms of happiness, in terms of flourishing, in the terms of cultivating your full human freedom. It is best to pursue these virtues. You will have a better life if you seek them out, period. Or maybe not, period. Maybe semicolon, right? We don't want to negate that, but here we want to add to it. We want to say, maybe here's another truth that you have to add to the truth of virtue. You have to you could add this truth in there, and you could call it maybe the truth of tragedy, right? So there's the truth of virtue, there's the truth of tragedy, and again, with Melville, life is big and can encompass like these many different truths that don't have to exclude one another necessarily. And the truth of virtue and the truth of tragedy can both be true. Well, what is the truth of tragedy? It's something you guys are all familiar with. Everybody's familiar with just by being alive, right? Which is that bad things don't just happen to bad people. Bad things happen to good people, to virtuous people, to everybody, right? The rain falls on the good and on the wicked alike. That's the way the book of Proverbs puts it. And the virtues that Starbuck has and that we try to cultivate as Sloka students and faculty, these virtues can only protect you up to a point, right? Every one of us is vulnerable to chance, to fate, to just like randomness and evil. And if you've gone to Sloka and if you've read Shakespeare and if you've read Greek tragedy, you have studied how human beings have wrestled with the tragic dimension of our existence, which none of us can totally ignore for very long. Melville puts it a little bit later in Moby-Dick. He says, all men live enveloped in whale lines. All men live enveloped in whale lines, right? Our existence is precarious. You never know when one of these lines might snap and take you with it. And that's just a fact of the world, just the same way that like goodness and kindness and respect and all those virtues are also facts of the world. And so Starbuck is going to say, I love this. This is a quote. Starbuck says, I will not have any man in my boat who is not afraid of a whale. For a fearless man is more dangerous than a coward, right? The fearless man might do some rash things and unnecessarily get you hurt. So please, Starbuck says, give me a crew that feels fear in the appropriate amounts at the appropriate times. Doesn't succumb to fear, but it knows that there are things to be afraid of, right? The fear of the whale is the beginning of wisdom. That's the subtitle of the lecture. The fear of the whale is the beginning of wisdom. The fear of what is larger and more ancient and more powerful than you is wise. When something frightening is happening, it is right and good to be afraid of it. It's better to confront danger and to feel fear and really to know it than it is to like hide away and feel nothing and understand nothing and go through life with no wisdom. Literature and tragedy in particular can help us confront our fears in a safe way, right? Because it's just a story. It's not actually happening to us, but we can still experience some of that fear, right? This is why we like horror movies and like sad songs that make us cry, and it feels good because we experience what Aristotle calls a catharsis of pity and fear, right? A catharsis of pity and fear. Catharsis means purging, expelling, getting rid of the fear that's in your system. When you confront that fear and that darkness in the form of a fictional story, which can't actually hurt you, and so you confront it safely and you get to know it and you gain wisdom. This is the wisdom of tragedy, right? This is an important part of your literary education, your Sloka education, your education in character, really. So there's the truth of the virtues, there's the truth of tragedy. And we have to realize that both of these things can be great teachers. Tragedy can be a great teacher. Fear can be a great teacher if we have the virtues, if we have enough courage in order to face our fears and not be paralyzed by them. This kind of virtue is available to us all. Now, this is like a big point that Ishmael goes on and on about for an entire page. And really, it's one of the most sort of like ramped up, rhetorically inflated passages that we've encountered so far, at least in Moby-Dick. And this is page 119. This is the top of page 119, where he's talking about Starbuck and like sort of the virtue and the dignity of Starbuck. And he says, "This august dignity I treat of is not the dignity of kings and robes, but that abounding dignity which has no robed investiture." And you're like, okay, what does that mean? And he says, I'm not talking about the dignity that you have from like wearing nice clothes and you're the king. He's saying, I'm talking about the dignity that we all possess. Every person has no robed investiture. He says, "Thou shalt see this dignity shining in the arm that wields a pick or drives a spike," right? Ordinary manual laborers. That democratic dignity, which on all hands radiates without end from God himself, the great God absolute, the center and circumference of all democracy, his omnipresence, our divine equality. And so he goes on and he says, look, if I mean then if then to meanest mariners and renegades and castaways I shall hereafter ascribe high qualities, though dark, weave round them tragic graces, and even if the most mournful, perchance the most abased among them all, shall at times lift himself to the exalted mounts, if I shall touch that workman's arm with some ethereal light, if I shall spread a rainbow over his disastrous set of sun, then against all mortal critics, bear me out in it, thou just spirit of equality, which has spread one royal mantle of humanity over all my kind. Bear me out in it, thou great democratic God. And he keeps going on and on. But here's the point, that the key idea here is summed up in that phrase that Ishmael uses, our democratic dignity, right? Ishmael is asserting that the heart of the American project is a belief that all of us, democratically, the people, the demos, we have infinite dignity as bearing the image and likeness of God, who he calls, quote, the center and circumference of all democracy. And okay, like on the one hand, he is sort of jokingly invoking this medieval idea. You guys, if you were here last year, you probably remember this. That's sort of a commonplace of medieval philosophy, that God is like a circle whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere, right? God is a circle whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. And Ishmael is using it to say that like democracy is the best political system because we are all equally divine. And every working man's arm reflects the dignity of the Lord as much as like a king's noble robes or something like that. But look, like each one of us is the center of God. And also none of us is the center of God because God's circumference is nowhere. So God has no center, but we are all the center. And so when we're all the center, democracy is the best political system. It's not just like the king is at the top and the king has more of God than we do. It's like, no, this is the basis of like a radical equality and democracy. You don't need a king like Oedipus or a prince like Prince Hamlet for somebody to write an epic or a tragedy about your life. Everybody's life matters, not just the kings and the princes. An ordinary Yankee whaler like Starbuck is going to do just fine, Melville says. I can elevate his dignity and bear me out in it, because in elevating his dignity, I am showing you the sort of great democratic mantle that is over all humanity, the spirit of equality that is borne out by the great democratic God, right? Turns out God is an American, right? God is a Democrat. Melville is saying, in the sense of he believes in the equality of people. There's a line in I think it's the New Testament. God is no respecter of persons. He doesn't care about your status, right? He cares about your heart, not your how much more noble you are than your neighbor. Melville, this is an important point for like Melville and really for all American literature after Melville. Melville is essentially saying, yes, look, I'm going to write a tragedy about common, ordinary people, which will express this grand truth of American democracy, that we're all equal before God. And like, any of you elitist European aristocrats who have a problem with this can like take a long walk off a short pier. And his rhetoric, he starts getting really heated in his rhetoric as the stakes get higher and higher and the passage continues. But it's also the reductio ad absurdum thing where his rhetoric becomes more absurd the more heated he gets, the more he's like trying to make his point, the more he kind of undercuts it. And he starts using these like thee and thou words. Did you notice this toward the end of the passage? And he starts using these archaic words, these verbs like didst and selectest. And he says, quote, thou who didst clothe with doubly hammered leaves of finest gold the stumped and poppered arm of old Cervantes. And it's like, does he even know what he's talking about here? He's like, okay, Cervantes, the author of Don Quixote, we know him. But he goes on about like comparing him to Andrew Jackson. And he says, God, thou ever cullest thy selectest champions from the kingly commons. And you're like, oh my gosh, like this, thou ever cullest thy selectest champions. Like, really, Melville? He's being absurd yet again. And he's using the reductio ad absurdum, and yet he's also expressing what comes to be sort of the foundations of all American literature, which is that we can choose our own characters from the kingly commons, from ordinary people like you or me. We don't need to choose from like kings and queens to write about. We can write about everybody. We commoners are kingly in a sense, and worth writing about. That's Melville's fundamental Americanness, which is on display in all its, selectest glory here in this chapter. Okay, quickly moving through the other mates. That was Starbuck. He goes into some detail about Starbuck. We got the second mate now, Stubb. Starbuck's the first mate. Stubb is the second mate. And Stubb is like the opposite of Starbuck. He's happy-go-lucky, and he is good-humored, and he is careless, right? Another negation. And he's somebody for whom, quote, long usage had converted the jaws of death into an easy chair. So basically, Stubb has spent so much time whaling in this like super dangerous profession that he's no longer really even like made uncomfortable by its extreme dangers, right? That's one way to deal with danger. You just get so used to it that you don't even notice it. And Stubb is like, imagine this, like they're in these tiny little wooden boats in the middle of the ocean, like nothing around. And you're like after these huge creatures that could like totally just destroy you with their tails. And you're like going after them with harpoons and like ropes and stuff like that. And Stubb is just going about his business, smoking his pipe, just as if he were in his armchair at home by the fire. And so he is differentiated from Starbuck in that sense. The third mate is named Flask. So there's Starbuck, Stubb, and Flask. Flask is short, and he is described as, quote, very pugnacious concerning whales. So he's like spoiling for a fight. Stubb takes nothing seriously or personally, and Flask kind of has a chip on his shoulder against the whales, like they insulted him or his mother or something, and he's going to go after them with relish. And each of these three mates, Starbuck, Stubb, and Flask, each of these three mates has a harpooneer attached to them. Note the double E at the end of that word, right? It's not harpooner, it's harpooneer with two E's. Queequeg, our friend Queequeg, gets paired with Starbuck. Ishmael is just like one of the guys rowing in the boat, right? He's not like a mate or a harpooneer. Stubb gets paired with a guy named Tashtigo, and Flask has Dagu. We don't get too much about these guys yet, but they are pretty cool eventually. The mates, Starbuck, Stubb, and Flask, are all like Massachusetts born. They're all like harpooneers and Americans. But they're all New Englanders and Americans. The harpooneers are not, right? They are savages. Although I think Tashtigo is like a Native American from one of the islands and off the coast of Massachusetts. And maybe that's all we'll say about the arrangement right now, but just note the way those guys are paired up, the way they're yoked together for now. And we'll come back to them. Speaking of pipes, also, we finally get a bit of Ahab here in chapter 30, I want to say. And we'll talk more about Ahab next time as he starts to reveal his plan to the crew on the next set of readings. He hasn't really done that yet. But for now, at least he's here. And take a look at the bottom of page 130. And this is the pipe chapter, chapter 30. And he says... now, Ahab is going to be going out to sea, and like Stubb, he's smoking his pipe. But unlike Stubb, Ahab takes the pipe and he throws it into the water. And he says, this smoking no longer soothes. Oh, my pipe, hard must it go with me if thy charm be gone. Here I have been unconsciously toiling, not pleasuring, et cetera, et cetera. And he says, what business have I with this pipe? This thing that is meant for sereneness, to send up mild white vapors among mild white hairs, not among torn iron gray locks like mine. I'll smoke no more. And then he throws the pipe still lit into the sea, and the fire hisses as it goes out in the waves. And it's like highly symbolic. And of course, the symbolism is not hard to pick up on. We're leaving behind the last of the comforts of home, of land, of harbor, and we're really pushing off toward landlessness, away from safety and domesticity and civilization and all the things that the pipe represents. So goodbye. I'll just throw it on the chair. Finally, let's get a real quick look at Stubb's dream. Stubb's dream, in chapter 29, before the dream, Ishmael draws attention to Ahab's prosthetic leg, which of course is made of whalebone, and Ahab ends up kicking Stubb with it at one point. I think Stubb was sort of like saying, "Hey, Ahab, can you keep it down when you're walking on the deck with your whalebone leg? It's really loud to those of us who are below decks trying to sleep." And Ahab just gives him a kick. And on page 131, this is the Queen Mab chapter. I think it's chapter 31. Stubb notes, and this is so important. I'm going to just find this and put a little check next to it. Stubb notes that, quote, there is a mighty difference. There is a mighty difference between a living thump and a dead thump. Okay, he's talking about whether a blow comes from a living limb or from a dead one. Okay, what is he talking about? Imagine this. Imagine you are walking along and a coconut falls down and hits you on the head. You would be in a great deal of pain, probably, but you wouldn't be, angry at the tree. Or at least you wouldn't be angry for long, right? It's not the same as getting angry as a person who bopped you on the head, just as hard. What's the difference between the living thump of a person and the dead thump of the coconut? Well, the difference, of course, is intent, right? Intent, it turns out, makes all the difference. The tree did not intend to harm you, so what's the point in being mad? If you kick the tree back, you'll only hurt your leg in addition to hurting your head, and you've got yourself to blame. So when the coconut hits you, the smartest thing to do is to not hit it back, right? Save yourself some extra pain. Realize that this was not a living thump. There was no intent behind it, just a dead thump, just one of those random things that happens in life. Maybe you can get mad at the person who didn't put up a sign saying, danger, coconuts, or something like that. You can't get mad at the tree, or at least not rationally. Keeping this distinction in mind, keeping this dream in mind, we have to remember that Ahab has been, quote, dismasted, right? This is whaler speak for saying his leg has been ripped off by a whale. Now he's got a whalebone peg leg. Maybe the wise thing for Ahab would be to say, well, there's no use in taking this wound too personally, right? The whale obviously didn't intend to do me harm. It was just biting and defending itself when I was throwing harpoons at it. And, as Ron Swanson points out in Parks and Rec, a whale is just an animal and it's just doing what animals do. And there is no necessarily conscious malice or like intent behind the whale biting my leg off. That's maybe how you and I might react after we were initially upset. We'd get over it. After all, like, what is there? You can only assign blame when there's intent. But Ahab, as we will see in the coming chapters, begins to imbue his wound, his missing leg, with another more sinister, more esoteric, almost more demonic idea. Ahab starts to think about all the ways that the universe is unfair to each one of us personally, and the many ways that we are hurt and disappointed by life, as we all are at some point or another. And Ahab starts to take all of these things and roll them up into like a little rage ball, and he starts to load up, all this litany of limitless suffering and the kind of like infinite indignities that go into like living as a human being. And he starts to put these things onto this one creature, this white whale. Why white? Because it's blank, right? And on a blank sheet of paper, you can inscribe whatever meaning you choose. And Ahab, this is, sorry, making a long story very short, it happened because life is random, and coconuts fall because gravity, which is an impersonal law, or if these thumps the universe gives us are living thumps, right? As if the universe somehow intended to send us suffering for some reason that we can't explain, and then maybe we can be mad because there is some kind of intent here, and we want to object. Something in us objects. It says no, right? Then we talked about the fact of no from William James. Okay, Ahab needs to know. He needs to know whether the universe is random and the stuff just happens, or whether there's a plan here. And if there is a plan, why the hell isn't it a better one, right? Why do we all have to suffer? Why do bad things have to happen to good people? In a sense, right, it would be better if the universe were totally lifeless and dead and random and stuff just happened according to natural laws. There's no deep moral order. It's just like sort of atoms in the void smashing into each other and creating events and life and history and all that. That would almost be like an easier universe to live in a way. It's a universe that makes no moral sense. And so when morally senseless things happen, like genocide, or like the coconut that falls on you, or like all this awful stuff, big and small, that it just goes along with being human. If the universe makes no moral sense, then that actually makes a kind of sense, because all this pain that we have seems to be senseless too. And so that would go together. We could live with that in a way. But here's the problem. It's Ahab's problem and it's our problem. Here it is. The universe actually does seem to make a kind of moral sense, right? There is right and wrong here. There is an intelligible moral order. There are things that we would say are bad and some things that we would say are good, and they're not just like totally relative. Like we would just say this is good, this is bad. And that the presence of this moral order makes suffering all the more mysterious, all the more incoherent for somebody like Ahab, right? Suffering becomes really difficult to swallow if there actually is an intelligible moral order. If there's an intelligible moral order, then suffering becomes unintelligible to us. So Ahab says, I'm going to take this, I'm going to spit this right back out. I can't accept this the way things are. And he's going to rage against it, even to the point of blasphemy against the moral order. So here we come, in a way, to the heart of Moby-Dick. And we're here a little prematurely because we haven't really seen Ahab sort of explain this on his own terms, but I'll kind of try to set this up for you. The heart of Moby-Dick is not necessarily the question, like, why is there evil? That question, why is there evil, is important, but that's not the heart of it. The question is, Why is the question of why is there evil above anyone's pay grade to answer? Why is there no, it's not that like why is there no evil, it's like why can we ask that question, why is there no evil, but not answer it, right? Nobody has the full and complete answer to this question. We've got our theories, we've got our intuitions, but nobody really knows why bad things happen to good people. We can sometimes have these pieties like everything happens for a reason, but we don't know that. Nobody knows. So in that case, if nobody's got the answer, why are we allowed to ask this question? And how should we respond to suffering when we don't have the answer? And all of this is going to go back. You know, some literary critic somewhere once said that all books are really the book of Job. And what that means, all books are really the book of Job, is that all books are really trying to answer this question of like, what do we do with our lives when we suffer? Like, what do we do with suffering? In the Bible, asks God this question quite directly, and he says, why? And God responds. And God says, look, I could tell you, but you wouldn't understand at this level. And so God sort of says, like, where were you when the foundations of the world were laid? Where were you when like I put the Leviathan in the sea? And, you know, who are you to even ask this question? And it's not like necessarily like a defensiveness on God's part. It's sort of just like, well, this is the way things are, is that this is not the kind of question that human beings can ever know. Our fate as people is that we ask questions that are too big for us to know and answer. But Ahab wants to know anyway. Ahab is the anti-Job in some ways, right? Job comes to accept this answer that we can't find the answer, at least on this side of life, to these questions, and Ahab won't accept it. Ahab is sort of like, you know, when I was a kid, did you guys ever have this? My parents used to say to me, you know, when I would ask them too many questions, they would say like, well, we'll tell you when you're older. Right. And that's sort of like the response, like you'll know later. And Ahab just won't accept that answer any longer. Right. He's saying, I'm not a child. I need to know. And in tragedy, in the world of Ahab is full of hubris, the tragic flaw of hubris, in wanting to know what nobody can know, which is the meaning of suffering. This has not been given to us to know. And so thus, when Ahab is described on page 84 as, quote, a grand, ungodly, godlike man. This is important. A grand, ungodly, godlike man. What Melville is saying here is that Ahab has made a mistake in trying to be too grand, too godlike in his knowledge of good and evil in the universe. Ahab has become ungodly. He has sort of stepped beyond where the limits that God has ascribed to human beings, and he's stepped outside of the bounds of wisdom and is now seeking knowledge that has not been given him to know. And this is what makes Ahab, the character, beautiful and human and tragic and damned all at once, right? He's a tragic figure for the modern age. He's an American. He's seeking these things that are beyond what we can know. And we respect him for it, even as we recognize, whoa, this is demonic. This is not okay. You have broken beyond the bounds of wisdom and of safety. And so if that is still not quite very clear, that is okay. You'll get it better in Ahab's words pretty soon in the quarterdeck chapter and the doubloon chapter, and as we start to understand what has happened to him in his encounter with the white whale. So, okay, in the coming readings, we'll talk more specifically about Ahab and his tragic flaw. That's kind of it for now. That's a lot, I know. Please note that next we're going to skip chapter 32, right? That's the next chapter. It's called Cetology, chapter 32. Read it if you want. It's great. It's another like reductio ad absurdum chapter, but this time instead of doing that to like theological discourse, he's doing that to scientific discourse, and he's going to turn scientific discourse into a parody of itself. And it is, though, one of the longer digressions. So yeah, let's skip this chapter if you want to. We'll move on to chapter 33 after spring break. Okay, so that's it for now. Have a really lovely and restful break and enjoy this time of solitude and family. And please, everyone, be safe and take care of each other and call each other and stay in touch. I'm going to sign off for now. It is now starting to get dark outside, and I go on for too long. So I will see you guys when I see you. Happy spring break.